The Duke of Alistair St. John, considered Miss Eleanor Vance with the same dispassionate eye he might use to assess a promising filly at Tattersall's. She was, by all accounts, a sound investment. Her bloodlines were respectable, if not dazzling. Her dowry was sufficient, if not spectacular, and her demeanor was, above all else, quiet. He watched her from across the grand ballroom of Harrington House, a solitary figure near a potted fern, her dove-gray silk blending into the marble of the wall behind her. She did not sparkle. She did not hold court. She simply existed, a placid island in a sea of chattering, peacocking humanity. It was this very quality, this profound lack of public presence, that had cemented his decision. Alistair had no need for a sparkling duchess. He had need of a functional one. His life was a complex machinery of political maneuvering, agricultural reform, and the meticulous management of one of England's most significant estates. A wife, in his estimation, was to be a silent, graceful component in that machine, a chatelaine, a hostess, a future mother to an heir. He required someone who would not disrupt the intricate workings with inconvenient opinions, emotional demands, or, heaven forbid, a desire for the spotlight. He turned to his host, Lord Harrington, a man whose primary interests were gossip and horses in that order. "I have made my selection," Alistair said, his voice low and devoid of inflection. Harrington followed his gaze to the girl by the fern. "Miss Vance? Good God, Alistair, I thought you were looking for a wife, not a piece of furniture. She is a mouse, a perfectly pleasant, well-bred mouse, I'll grant you, but a mouse nonetheless." "Mice do not cause scandals," Alistair returned coolly. "Mice do not run up exorbitant bills at the modiste. Mice do not embarrass their husbands with ill-considered political pronouncements at dinner parties." He took a sip of his champagne, the bubbles doing little to enliven his mood. "She is perfectly suitable, biddable, orderly." He paused, delivering his final damning piece of praise. "And she cannot speak in public. It is a blessing." Harrington chuckled, shaking his head. "You are a cold devil, Blackwood, marrying a woman for what she lacks." "I am a practical man," Alistair corrected. "I am marrying her for the peace she will provide." Across the room, Eleanor Vance felt the weight of the Duke's gaze. She had felt it for the better part of an hour. It was not the admiring glance of a suitor nor the curious peek of a stranger. It was an appraisal. She was accustomed to being overlooked, but this was different. This was being catalogued. She smoothed a hand over her gray silk, the fabric cool and unadorned. She knew what men like the Duke of Alistair saw when they looked at her. They saw a blank canvas, a quiet vessel, a convenient solution to the dynastic problem of an empty nursery and a vacant seat at the head of their table. They did not see the mind behind her calm eyes, a mind that was at that very moment translating the frantic Italian of a nearby spatting couple, cataloging the architectural flaws in Lord Harrington's new ceiling plaster, and composing in her head a wry, cutting critique of the Prime Minister's latest speech on the Corn Laws. They did not see the woman who ran her household with the precision of a field marshal, who could read a balance sheet faster than most men could read a racing form, and who found a deeper solace in the rigorous logic of Marcus Aurelius than in the vapid flattery of any London ballroom. She knew they did not see it. It was, after all, by design. Her quietness was a shield, her stillness a fortress. In a world that had so little use for a clever woman, she had learned that the safest place to be was in plain sight, utterly unseen. But the Duke's stare was persistent. It promised a disruption to her carefully curated invisibility. It promised a cage, albeit a gilded one. When he began to move through the crowd, his path an unwavering line directly toward her, a strange and unwelcome resignation settled in her heart. The appraisal was over. The acquisition was about to begin. His proposal, when it came 3 days later in her father's stiffly formal drawing room, was much like his gaze at the ball, direct, dispassionate, and utterly devoid of romance. He did not speak of affection or even of admiration. He spoke of mutual benefit, of shared responsibilities, of the station she would occupy and the duties she would be expected to perform. "You would be the Duchess of Allister," he stated, as if presenting a clause in a contract. "Your duties would include the management of the household staff at Blackwood Manor and our London residence, the hosting of a prescribed number of social and political events per season, and, in due course, the provision of an heir." He paused, his gray eyes meeting hers. "In return, you would have the security and prestige of the title, and the full financial support of my estate. I am a man of my word, and I am not given to caprice. You would find me a reliable, if not an effusive, partner." It was the most honest thing any man had ever said to her. He was not pretending to be in love. He was offering a position. And Eleanor, who had always valued honesty above all else, found herself in the strange position of appreciating his cold-blooded candor. It was an insult, of course, a deep and profound one, to be chosen as one would choose a dependable carriage horse. But it was an insult delivered without deceit. Her father, a man perpetually flustered by his intelligent, unmarriageable daughter, was practically vibrating with excitement. This was a deliverance beyond his wildest dreams. Eleanor looked at the Duke, at his severe, handsome face, his posture of unshakable self-assurance. He saw her as a cipher, a decorative zero. There was a perverse challenge in it. Could she exist within the confines he had built for her? Could she maintain the sanctuary of her own mind while living as this man's placid, silent duchess? "Your Grace," she said, her voice even and low, betraying none of the turmoil within. "Your offer is very clear. I find clarity to be a rare and valuable commodity." She met his gaze without flinching. "I accept your terms." Alistair felt a flicker of something akin to relief. It had been as simple as he had anticipated. The transaction was complete. He had acquired his duchess. He did not notice the faint, ironic curl of her lip as she said it. He did not register the subtle intelligence in her choice of the word terms. He saw only her compliance, her quiet agreement. He saw exactly what he had wanted to see. Their engagement was a whirlwind of legal documents and social obligations. Alistair was briskly efficient, Eleanor placidly cooperative. They were a model of decorum. Society matrons approved of the match, citing Miss Vance's serene temperament as a perfect foil for the Duke's formidable gravity. He was a pillar of the realm. She would be the quiet, elegant plinth upon which he stood. It was during a visit to the Blackwood Library, a vast two-story cathedral of leather and paper, that the first crack in Alistair's perception appeared. He had been wrestling for weeks with a set of particularly tangled estate accounts from a newly acquired property in the north. The previous owner had been a man of creative, if not criminal, bookkeeping, and Alistair's own steward was baffled. He was bent over a ledger, a furrow of frustration carved between his brows, when Eleanor entered. She moved with her usual quiet grace, her footsteps barely disturbing the motes of dust dancing in the shafts of afternoon light. He expected her to select a book of poetry or a novel and retreat to a chair by the window. Instead, she paused by his desk. For a long moment, she simply stood there, her gaze on the chaotic columns of figures. "Is something amiss, Your Grace?" he asked, a touch impatiently. He was not accustomed to being disturbed at his work. "The wool yields," she said, her voice soft. "He has calculated them against the gross weight after washing, but he has based his shipping costs on the raw fleece weight. The discrepancy is in the transport ledger, not the production one." Alistair froze. He slowly straightened, turning to look at her. She was not looking at him, but at the ledger, her finger hovering an inch above a specific column of spidery ink. He followed her invisible line, his own eyes scanning the figures. He flipped back 2 pages to the transport costs, did a swift calculation in his head, and felt a jolt of stunned comprehension. She was right. It was a complex piece of accounting, a deliberate obfuscation he and his steward had spent the better part of a fortnight trying to unravel. She had deciphered it in less than a minute. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since his proposal. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, analytical calm. "How did you know that?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. She finally lifted her gaze to his. "My father's estate is small, but it has a great many sheep. I have managed the books for the past 5 years." She gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "It is a simple enough error to make, or to hide." Alistair stared at her. He had married her because she was quiet and biddable. He had assumed these qualities were rooted in a simplicity of mind. The woman standing before him, who had just effortlessly sliced through a Gordian knot of financial deception, was anything but simple. It was a disquieting thought. He had selected a component for his machine, only to discover it had a complex internal mechanism he had not anticipated. "I see," he said, his tone clipped. "Thank you." He dismissed it. He had to. He filed the incident away as an anomaly, a strange quirk of her country upbringing. She had a head for sheep. It was unexpected, but ultimately irrelevant to her primary duties as his duchess. He had his answer. He turned back to the ledger, and she, as if sensing his dismissal, drifted away to the poetry section. The machine was still functioning as designed. He would not allow one surprising cog to make him question the entire apparatus. They were married a month later. The ceremony was grand, tasteful, and impersonal. Eleanor moved through it all with a serene composure that everyone took for contentment. Alistair stood beside her, feeling a sense of satisfaction. The transaction was finalized, the title was hers, the peace was his. They settled into life at Blackwood Manor. Eleanor was, as he had predicted, a flawless duchess. The household ran with unprecedented smoothness. Menus were planned, guests were seated, and social engagements were managed with a quiet efficiency that was nothing short of remarkable. She was a ghost in the machine. Her presence felt only in the perfect, seamless operation of her domain. She was present and she was absent. She was there and she was not there. She would sit at the opposite end of the long, polished dining table, a silent, beautiful figure in the candlelight. She would respond to his questions about her day with polite, brief answers. She would listen to his monologues about parliamentary debates or crop rotation with an attentive stillness, but she offered nothing of herself. He had married her for her silence, and she gave it to him in abundance. And yet, he began to feel a strange, creeping sense of disappointment. He would occasionally try to provoke a reaction, to find the woman who had dissected his ledgers. He would mention a complex political problem, hoping for a spark of the insight she had shown. "The trade bill is stalled in committee," he said one evening. "Peel's faction is proving intractable." "Indeed, Your Grace," she replied, her eyes on her plate. "Will you be requiring the carriage for London tomorrow?" It was like knocking on a beautifully carved door only to find it opened onto a bare wall. The flicker of surprise he had felt in the library began to morph into a low-grade, persistent irritation. He had paid for a mouse, and he had gotten one. Why was he not more pleased? The answer, he told himself, was that he was simply not used to such passivity. His world was one of argument, of debate, of intellectual combat. Her placidity was an alien landscape. He would grow accustomed to it. It was, after all, what he had wanted. The revelation came 2 months into their marriage. It was a Tuesday. Alistair had returned early from a ride, the crisp autumn air having cleared his head. He was making his way to the library when he heard voices from within. One was Lord Harrington's, dripping with its usual indolent amusement. The other was his own. He paused, realizing it was an echo from the past. Harrington had come to visit. "I must say, Alistair, you were right about her," Harrington was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the slightly ajar door. "She's the perfect ornament. Beautiful, silent, and utterly untroubling. You've trained her well." Alistair felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. He did not like the proprietary, dismissive tone Harrington used. He opened his mouth to enter and issue a sharp rebuke. But then he heard his own voice, cool and measured, and it stopped him cold. "She is not trained, Harrington. She is, as I told you, exactly what I required. A duchess who understands her role. It is a great relief to have a wife who performs her duties silently. She cannot speak in public, and that, I find, remains her greatest asset." He had said it again. Not as a prediction, but as a statement of fact, a confirmation of his success. He was defending his choice, and in doing so, he was delivering the same mortal insult he had at the ball. He was praising her for being a beautiful automaton. A small sound from within the library, other than the men's voices, made him freeze. It was the softest whisper of movement, the rustle of a skirt, the faintest click of a book being placed back on a shelf. His blood ran cold. He pushed the door open. Harrington was lounging in a leather armchair, a glass of brandy in his hand. Alistair's gaze, however, shot past him, to the tall, shadowed stacks at the far end of the room. He saw nothing. He heard nothing more. "Alistair, just telling Harry how you've won the marital lottery," Harrington crowed. Alistair barely heard him. He walked slowly toward the back of the library, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He peered down a narrow aisle between shelves dedicated to philosophy. The space was empty, but a single book, a heavy volume of Plato's Republic, was not quite flush with its neighbors. It had been recently replaced, and on the floor, almost invisible against the dark wood, was a small, embroidered bookmark. He bent and picked it up. It was hers. He recognized the delicate needlework. She had been there. She had heard everything. A wave of something he could not name, shame, dread, a sudden horrifying clarity washed over him. He had not merely thought these things. He had not merely said them in confidence to a friend. He had declared them, twice, as the very foundation of their union. And she had heard it. She had heard herself described as a functional, silent asset. He turned, his face a mask of stone. "Harrington," he said, his voice lethally quiet, "I believe your visit is concluded." Harrington, startled by his tone, sputtered for a moment before gathering himself and making a hasty retreat. Alistair was left alone in the vast, silent library. He looked at the bookmark in his hand. He thought of her face, her placid, unreadable expression. He had mistaken her composure for simplicity, her silence for an absence of thought. What a fool he had been. A blind, arrogant fool. He expected a confrontation, a storm of tears, a furious tirade. He braced himself for it when he went in to dinner that evening. But there was nothing. Eleanor was seated in her usual place. She wore a gown of deep sapphire that made her skin look like porcelain. She inclined her head as he entered. "Good evening, Your Grace." Her voice was the same. Her expression was the same. Nothing was different, and yet everything was. It was a closing, not a slamming of a door, but the soft, final click of a well-oiled lock. Before, her silence had been a placid lake. Now it was a frozen one. The surface was smooth and impenetrable, and beneath it everything was still. The change was subtle at first. So subtle that for a week, he thought he might have imagined it. But he was a man who noticed details, and the details began to accumulate with chilling precision. She had always played the pianoforte in the drawing room after dinner. Soft, melancholic pieces by Chopin that filled the cavernous space with a fragile beauty. The music stopped. The pianoforte remained closed, its polished surface gathering a thin film of dust. He noticed it on the third night. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was cavernous. It was an absence. "You have not played this evening, Duchess," he remarked, trying to keep his tone casual. "I am not in the mood for it," she replied, not looking up from her needlework. Her stitches were tiny, perfect, and relentless. He noticed the flowers. She had always taken a personal hand in the arrangements, creating displays of startling, artistic beauty. Now the arrangements were done by a housemaid, They were competent but lifeless, symmetrical, predictable, and utterly without soul, just vases of flowers, where before there had been living art. He noticed it at the table. She had always eaten with a delicate, if modest, appetite. Now she barely touched her food. She moved it around her plate, creating the illusion of activity, but he saw the footman carry away a plate that was nearly as full as when it had been served. He began to watch her, truly watch her, with a new, desperate attention. He saw the tension in the line of her shoulders, a rigidity that had not been there before. He saw the way her gaze was always fixed on something in the middle distance, as if she were looking through him, through the very walls of the house. She was a perfect automaton. She performed her duties with flawless, chilling precision. She was everything he had told Harrington he wanted, and it was unbearable. The silence he had craved now roared in his ears. The peace he had sought felt like a tomb. He had successfully erased the woman and been left with only the Duchess. He started to search for the person he had caught glimpses of, the woman in the library. He brought her the estate books again, feigning confusion. "I cannot seem to reconcile these figures," he said, spreading them on the desk before her. She looked at them, her face impassive. "I am certain your steward will be able to assist you, Your Grace. My expertise is with sheep, as I believe I mentioned. This appears to be about timber." She turned and walked away. It was a polite, perfectly reasonable refusal. It was also the most profound rejection he had ever experienced. Anaphora began to beat a rhythm in his mind, a litany of his blindness. He thought about the quick, dry wit she had displayed once, when a visiting politician had droned on about the moral failings of the poor. "It is a wonder they have any morals at all," she had murmured, so quietly only he had heard, "given that they are so often forced to sell them for a loaf of bread." He had been startled then, and a little amused. Now the memory shamed him. He thought about the way the staff spoke of her. He had assumed their respect was for her station, but he began to listen more closely. It was not just respect, it was a fierce, protective loyalty. He overheard two maids talking in a corridor. "The Duchess asked after my mother again today," one said, "and sent down a pot of broth from the kitchens." He thought about the books he saw her reading. He had assumed they were frivolous novels. One day he went into her private sitting room when she was out. On her table were not romances, but a well-thumbed copy of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and a treatise on modern irrigation techniques. The clues accumulated, forming a devastating portrait of the woman he had married and the man who had been blind to her. He had seen a quiet surface and assumed there was no depth. He had looked at a star and seen only a distant, pale light, never considering the blazing furnace of its core. The turning point came via an unlikely source. Mr. Fletcher, the head butler, a man who had served the St. John family for 40 years and whose face was a study in professional impassivity. Alistair was in his study, staring into a cold fireplace, the silence of the house pressing in on him. Fletcher entered to inquire about the wine for dinner. "The house is too quiet," Alistair said, more to himself than to the butler. Fletcher paused in the doorway, his hand on the knob. "Indeed, Your Grace, the Duchess has ensured it is so." There was something in his tone, a subtle edge of meaning, that made Alistair look up. "What do you mean by that, Fletcher?" Fletcher met his master's gaze. For the first time in their long association, the butler's mask slipped, revealing a flicker of something that looked like pity. "Only that her Grace is an exceptionally perceptive woman, Your Grace. She gives people precisely what she believes they desire from her." The words landed like stones in the quiet room. She gives people precisely what she believes they desire from her. She believed he desired a silent, functional, invisible wife, and so she had become one. It was not an act of submission. It was an act of profound, cutting intelligence. She had listened to his terms, the ones spoken and the ones overheard, and she was honoring the contract to the letter. It was a malicious compliance of the soul. The full weight of his colossal foolishness crashed down upon him. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating wave. He had not just misjudged her. He had actively, cruelly, and publicly defined her by her limitations. Limitations he had invented. And she, in her quiet, devastating way, had decided to live within that definition, to hold up a mirror to his own callousness. "Fletcher," Alistair said, his voice hoarse, "where is the Duchess now?" "I believe she is at the old Dower House, Your Grace. She spends most of her afternoons there now." The Dower House had been empty for years, a slightly neglected building on the edge of the estate. What could she possibly be doing there? He did not wait for an answer. He strode from the room, his long legs eating up the corridors. He left the manor and walked, almost ran, across the manicured lawns, past the formal gardens, and onto the path that led toward the woods. As he approached the Dower House, he heard it. It was a sound he had not heard in months, a sound that was utterly out of place. It was the sound of children's voices reciting their letters in a cheerful, chaotic chorus. He stopped behind a large oak tree, his heart pounding. He peered through the overgrown ivy that clung to the old stone walls. Through a window, he saw a sight that stopped his breath. The main parlor of the Dower House had been transformed. The dusty furniture was gone, replaced by small wooden benches and trestle tables. The walls were covered in chalkboards and pinned-up pages of letters and numbers. And in the center of it all stood Eleanor. She was not the silent, placid duchess of his dinner table. This woman was vibrant, alive. A small smudge of chalk was on her cheek. Her hair had a few loose tendrils that had escaped her usually perfect coiffure. She was pointing to a chalkboard, and a dozen small children, the children of his tenant farmers and estate workers, were looking up at her with rapt attention. "And this letter," she was saying, her voice clear and warm and full of a patient energy he had never heard before, "makes the coo sound, like in cat or in kind. It is very important to be kind, is it not?" A chorus of "Yes, Duchess," answered her. She was teaching them to read, in secret. She had taken this derelict house and filled it with light and learning. She had taken the silence he had imposed on her and used it to build a world of her own. A world where her voice mattered, where her intelligence was not a liability, but a gift. He watched her move among the children, correcting a grip on a piece of chalk, praising a well-formed letter, offering a gentle smile to a shy little girl in the back row. She was radiant. And he, the Duke of Alistair, the master of all he surveyed, had been utterly, profoundly blind. He had looked at this woman and seen nothing. He had declared to the world that she could not speak, while all along she was quietly teaching a new generation to find their own voice. The shame was no longer just a wave, it was an ocean. He felt himself drowning in it. He backed away from the window, stumbling like a drunkard. He turned and walked back to the manor, his mind a maelstrom of regret and a new, terrifying, and exquisitely painful emotion: awe. He knew what he had to do. Atonement was not enough. An apology was a pathetic, insufficient gesture. He had to tear down the entire structure of their marriage and begin again. But first, he had to confess. He had to stand before her and admit the full scope of his failure. He waited until evening. He found her not in the drawing room or her sitting room, but in the library, the scene of her humiliation. She was standing by a window, looking out at the twilight descending over the park. She did not turn as he entered. "Eleanor," he said. He used her given name for the first time since their wedding day. She stiffened slightly, but did not turn. "Your Grace." "I went to the Dower House this afternoon," he said, his voice quiet. Now she turned. Her face was a pale oval in the dimming light, her expression guarded, unreadable. "It is part of your estate. You may go where you please. I saw what you are doing there." He took a step closer. "I heard you." A flicker of something, defiance? Fear, crossed her face before the mask of composure slammed back into place. "I am causing no trouble. It is a discreet activity." "Discreet," he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "You have built a school. You are giving the children of my tenants the single greatest gift anyone could give them. And you call it a discreet activity because you were afraid of my disapproval. Because I, your husband, am a man you have to hide your best self from. Her silence was his answer. He closed the distance between them, stopping a few feet away. He had planned what he would say, but the carefully constructed sentences evaporated in the face of her terrible, quiet stillness. All that was left was the raw, ugly truth. I was wrong, he said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. That is not enough. I was a fool. I was a blind, arrogant, condescending fool. He saw a tremor go through her, the first crack in her icy composure. I overheard you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. In this room, with Lord Harrington. I know, he said. I knew it the moment I saw the empty space on the shelf. He took another step. What I said, it was not just an insult, Eleanor. It was a failure of perception so profound it amounts to a moral failing. I looked at you, and I chose not to see. I saw a quiet woman, and I assumed she was a simple one. I saw stillness, and I assumed it was emptiness. He gestured around the grand, silent room. I told Harrington I married you for the peace you would provide. I have had that peace for 2 months now. A house as silent as a crypt, a wife who is a perfect, beautiful stranger. The silence I so arrogantly craved is my punishment, and I deserve it, but you do not. He finally met her eyes, and he did not look away. I told him you could not speak in public. I see now that I am the one who could not hear. Tears welled in her eyes, shimmering in the twilight. She did not let them fall. She held them back with the same fierce control she held everything. But he had seen them. It was more emotion than she had shown him in their entire marriage. What do you want, Alistair? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. An apology? For me to pretend I did not hear what I heard? No, he said immediately. I want nothing from you. I have no right to ask for anything. Forgiveness is a gift I have not earned. I am here to tell you the truth. The woman I saw this afternoon at the Dower House, she is extraordinary. She is brilliant and compassionate and strong. She is the woman I should have seen from the very beginning. The fault is not in you for being who you are. The fault is in me for being too blind to see it. He did not try to touch her. He simply stood there, having laid his folly bare. He had made his confession. The next move, if there was to be one, was hers. For a long time she said nothing. The silence stretched, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with the weight of his words, with the shattering of old certainties. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. You said you married me for my silence. It was my greatest mistake, he said. Then you must learn to appreciate noise, she said. And with that she turned and walked out of the library, leaving him alone with the ghosts of his own making. Her words were not an absolution, they were a challenge. You must learn to appreciate noise. It was the first term of a new, unwritten contract. His atonement began the next day. A public opportunity presented itself, as if ordained by fate. A regional agricultural society, of which Alistair was the patron, was holding its annual meeting in the nearby town. The keynote speaker, an expert on land management, had been taken ill at the last minute. The organizers were in a panic. All eyes turned to the Duke, expecting him to step in. He stood up before the assembled landowners and farmers. He felt the familiar weight of their expectation. But this time, he did something different. Gentlemen, he began, his voice ringing through the hall, we are fortunate today. Though Mr. Abernathy is unable to join us, we have in our midst an expert whose practical knowledge and deep study of modern agricultural techniques far surpasses my own. A confused murmur ran through the crowd. Alistair turned and looked directly at his wife, who was seated in the front row, her expression a mixture of apprehension and shock. The work being done with crop rotation and soil revitalization on the Blackwood estate is not my innovation. The strategies were researched, conceived, and implemented by my wife, the Duchess. The murmur turned to stunned silence. Women did not address public gatherings of men. A duchess, especially a famously quiet one, certainly did not. He saw the panic in her eyes. He saw her about to shake her head, to refuse. He held her gaze and tried to pour every ounce of his newfound sincerity, his desperate plea for her to trust him, into that single look. "I was asked to speak," he continued, his voice softer now, but still carrying to every corner of the room. "But I would be doing this assembly a great disservice if I did not yield the floor to the person with the greater wisdom. I yield the floor to my wife." He extended a hand to her. It was the most public, most terrifying, and most profound act of faith he could imagine. He was not just inviting her to speak. He was staking his own considerable reputation on her ability to do so. He was publicly repudiating the cruel judgment he had passed on her. He was telling the world, "I was wrong. Listen to her." Eleanor stared at his outstretched hand. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to shrink back, to maintain the safe invisibility she had cultivated for so long. But then she looked at his face. She saw no command, no expectation of obedience. She saw a raw vulnerability she had never seen in him before. It was a plea. She thought of the children in her school. She thought of the books she had read in secret. She thought of the voice she had silenced for so long. Slowly, as if in a dream, she placed her hand in his. Alistair's fingers closed around hers, a warm, steady pressure. He led her to the podium. A gasp went through the hall. Lord Harrington, seated near the back, looked as if he might choke on his own astonishment. Eleanor stood at the podium. The sea of male faces stared up at her, a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and outright disapproval. For a moment, her throat closed. The lie he had once told felt like it might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. She cannot speak in public. Then she felt Alistair's presence just behind her, a silent, solid wall of support. He did not retreat to his seat. He stood with her. She took a breath. She looked out at the crowd, not as a duchess, not as a mouse, but as the woman who understood the economics of wool and the chemistry of soil. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice quiet at first, but clear and steady. "Mr. Abernathy was scheduled to speak on the folly of the single crop system. He is, of course, correct. But his theories do not go far enough." And then she began to speak. She did not shout. She did not posture. She simply explained, with irrefutable logic and a wealth of meticulously researched detail, a new model for tenant farming that would increase yields, improve the soil, and create a more sustainable and profitable estate for everyone. She spoke for 20 minutes. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then, one old farmer in the front row began to clap. Another joined him, then another, and within seconds, the entire hall had erupted in thunderous applause. Alistair did not clap. He simply watched her, his heart full of a feeling so immense and overwhelming he could not put a name to it. It was pride, yes, but it was more. It was the joy of discovery, the profound, humbling grace of being allowed to witness a miracle he had almost destroyed. On the carriage ride home, the silence was different again. It was not empty, nor was it tense. It was full, contemplative. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. She looked at her hands, folded in her lap. "You took a great risk." "I had faith," he replied, belatedly. She did not fall into his arms. The victory in the town hall was not a magic cure for the wounds he had inflicted. It was a beginning, a single step on a long road. The rebuilding of their marriage was a slow and deliberate process. He learned to appreciate noise. He would come into the library and find her debating a point of philosophy with the local vicar, her voice animated and sharp. He would not interrupt. He would sit and listen, marveling at the quickness of her mind. He formally made her the co-manager of the entire Alistair estate, and they spent hours poring over maps and ledgers together. Their conversations were no longer his monologues and her polite responses. They were true dialogues, partnerships of the mind. He sought her opinion, not as a courtesy, but because he had learned, time and again, that her perspective was invaluable. He began to court his own wife. He brought her not jewels, but a rare first edition of a book she admired. He did not take her to balls, but to visit a new type of watermill he had heard about, knowing she would be fascinated by the engineering. He learned to see the world through her eyes, to notice the things she noticed, to value the things she valued. The Dower House School flourished. He funded it personally, expanding it to include older children and even evening classes for adults. It became their shared project, the most visible symbol of their new union. The final external conflict was resolved with a satisfying quietness. At a London dinner party, Lord Harrington, still smarting from the public refutation of his judgment, attempted a jibe. "I hear you have become quite the public speaker, Duchess," he said with a sneer. "Alistair must be so surprised." Before Alistair could respond, Eleanor smiled sweetly at him. "Oh, my husband is never surprised by my capabilities, Lord Harrington," she said, her voice carrying across the table. "Only by the inability of others to perceive them. It is a flaw he has worked hard to correct in himself. Perhaps he could offer you some guidance." The table fell silent, and Harrington flushed a deep, mottled crimson. Alistair simply looked at his wife, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. He had never loved her more. A year passed. One crisp autumn afternoon, Alistair found Eleanor in the Dower House, just as he had that fateful day. The room was empty of children, the lessons for the day being over. She was standing by the window, looking out at the trees, their leaves a riot of gold and red. He came and stood beside her, his arm brushing against hers. For a while they stood in comfortable silence, watching the leaves fall. "Do you remember the day you accepted my proposal?" he asked softly. "You said you accepted my terms." She turned her head to look at him, a faint wry smile playing on her lips. "I remember." "I think," he said, taking her hand, "it is time we renegotiated." "Oh?" she said, her eyebrows rising in amusement. "And what are your new terms, Your Grace?" "There is only one," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He lifted her hand to his lips. "That you never, ever be silent on my account again." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I believe," she whispered, "I can agree to that term." He looked down at her, at this brilliant, resilient, extraordinary woman who was his wife. He saw her, finally. He saw all of her. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that the quietest woman in London had taught him everything he needed to know about listening. Their life together would be full of noise, of debate, of laughter, of shared thoughts and dreams. It would be a symphony, and he would spend the rest of his days profoundly grateful that he had learned, just in time, how to hear the music.